I know the sound of that silence that fills your room at 3 a.m. when the world sleeps, but your mind races with thoughts that cut like knives. I see how you turn your face to the wall, how your prayers feel like stones dropping into a bottomless well, how you wonder if anyone hears them at all. The emptiness after loss has weight, doesn't it? It presses on your chest until breathing becomes an act of courage. You have called out to God, to family, to friends who promised to stay, and yet here you sit, alone with questions that burn your throat. I know this solitude. I have lived within its walls, and I have found the hidden door that leads not away from this pain, but through it. I do not come to hurry you out of this desert. I come as one who has walked it barefoot and discovered an oasis where no map showed one could exist. The path I will show you is not an escape, but a descent, deeper into the very silence you fear, where waiting patiently is the water that sustains, where God's presence is most profound, precisely where His voice seems most absent. Your journey back to wholeness begins with the courage to remain exactly where you are. I remember the day I sat alone in the dust of Kanya, my throat parched from calling Shams's name into the empty streets. My beloved friend had vanished without warning, taking with him the light by which I had come to see everything. The sun continued to rise and set, as if the world had not been fundamentally altered. People continued to greet me with respect, unaware that I had become a hollow vessel, an abandoned home where joy once lived. I continued to teach, to pray, to fulfill my duties, but inside me was a silence so complete it seemed to swallow even my heartbeat. One night, unable to sleep, I walked out into the garden and looked up at the stars scattered across the dark canvas of night. I felt small and forgotten beneath that vast, indifferent sky. My prayers had become mechanical, empty rituals performed by a body going through remembered motions while the soul lay in ruins. I knelt on the cold ground, and for the first time did not try to fill the silence with petitions or praise. I simply knelt in it, with it, allowing the full weight of my desolation to settle upon me like a heavy cloak. And it was there, in the complete surrender to that silence, that I first heard it. Not a voice, not a message, but a presence that permeated the very emptiness I had been running from. The silence was not absence. It was fullness beyond language. God had not departed. He had transformed into the very space within which my grief echoed. This is the first paradox I offer you. Absence is a form of presence. Emptiness is a type of fullness. Silence is not God's withdrawal, but His most intimate speech. I had been calling out to God as if He were a distant figure I needed to summon, when all along He was the very ground beneath my knees, the very air entering my lungs, the very space within which my tears fell. What I sought with such desperate fervor was already containing me, already holding me, already whispering through the vessel of silence. The beloved was not hiding from me. I was hiding from the beloved by searching only in noise, in answers, in the familiar shapes of comfort. Many nights later, as I sat with this silence rather than struggling against it, I learned to breathe differently in its presence. Each inhale became a recognition, each exhale a surrender. I began to write poetry, not from the place of having answers, but from the raw wound of my questions. And in this practice, I discovered that my pain was not a punishment or a sign of God's absence. It was the very workshop in which my soul was being shaped into a more spacious dwelling for divine love. When Shams left, I thought God had turned His face from me. Now I understand that sometimes God removes the familiar cups from which we drink so that we might finally kneel at the stream itself. He takes away the comfortable ways we have known His presence so that we might discover Him anew, more directly, without the intermediaries of habit or expectation. This is love's severe mercy. This is the gift wrapped in what appears to be abandonment. Here is what I have learned and offer now to you. The silence that seems to reject you is actually inviting you into a deeper intimacy with the divine. Your pain is not a sign that you have been forgotten. It is a holy summons to remember differently. The cup of your life has been emptied not as punishment, but as preparation for a new wine, a more potent communion with what is real. Try this small practice when the silence becomes too heavy. Sit for 5 minutes each morning before the demands of the day begin. Place one hand on your heart. Breathe slowly in through your nose, out through your mouth. Do not pray for answers. Do not ask for relief. Simply say, "Here I am in this silence with you." Notice what arises without chasing it or pushing it away. This is not meditation as escape. It is meditation as honest presence with what is. The wound is where the light enters, yes, but first it is simply a wound. Honor it as such. The sacred does not only dwell in peace, it makes its most transformative home in our disruptions. Remember this truth I discovered in my darkest hour. When God seems most absent, He is preparing His most intimate revelation. The silence is not empty. It is pregnant with a whisper your soul is now learning to hear. The past carries a weight that bends the shoulders of even the strongest among us. I see how you try to outrun its shadow, how you smile for others while inside the old wounds still bleed, how you have tried 1,000 remedies, work, prayer, distractions, relationships, yet the ache persists like a faithful companion who refuses to leave your side. Sometimes in the quiet moments between one task and another, it rises up to remind you of what was lost, what was taken, what was never given. And with it comes the question that haunts the back of your mind. Will I ever be free of this pain? Will I ever be whole again? I too have carried wounds that refused to heal on the schedule I demanded. After Shams disappeared, I searched for him in every face, in every crowd, hoping that the rumors of his death were just that. Rumors. Each day without him was a fresh wound laid over the previous one. I became a master at hiding my suffering, at performing the duties expected of me while carrying an ocean of grief within. People came to me for wisdom while I felt I had none left to give. They saw the teacher, the poet, the spiritual leader. But inside, I was a man shattered by loss, trying desperately to gather the pieces of myself. It was on a winter morning in Kenya, the kind where dawn arrives reluctantly through a veil of frost, that I heard a knocking at my door. Half asleep, I opened it to find an old beggar standing there, his face weathered by years and hardship. "I have nothing to give today," I told him, the words coming out harsher than I intended. The man did not move. He simply looked at me with eyes that seemed to contain all the sorrow and joy of the world and said, "It is not I who have come for alms, but you." Then he was gone, leaving me standing at the threshold of my own home, suddenly aware that I had become a beggar at the door of my own life, asking for scraps of comfort while the feast of existence continued without me. I know you carry old wounds. I know some days they define you more than your name. I know how they whisper to you that you are damaged, unworthy, that joy is for others, but not for you. I want to ask you a question, and I ask you to be honest with me and yourself. How long will you allow what wounded you to continue determining the rhythm of your days? If this touched something real inside you, if you recognize this struggle, write in the comments, "My wounds no longer decide my worth." When you share this, you're not just freeing yourself, you're lighting a candle for someone still walking in darkness. Your courage to speak truth may be exactly what another soul needs to hear today. What I discovered after my encounter with the beggar was not how to erase my wounds, but how to carry them differently. The pain of losing Shams did not vanish, it transformed. It became not a prison, but a doorway through which I entered a larger understanding of love itself. This is the second paradox I offer you. Our deepest wounds become our most profound teachers when we stop trying to silence them and start listening to what they have come to say. That morning, I sat in the corner of my room, and for the first time, I spoke directly to my pain, as if it were a visitor with a message rather than an intruder to be expelled. "What have you come to show me?" I asked, and in the silence that followed, I began to sense that my attachment to Shams had become a barrier between myself and the greater beloved. I had mistaken the cup for the wine, the messenger for the message. My wound was not punishment, it was initiation into a more universal love, one not dependent on the presence or absence of any single form. God speaks to us through the language of experience, and sometimes the most profound teachings are written in the ink of loss. The heart breaks precisely where its barrier stands strongest. The wound appears exactly where we need to become more permeable to divine love. This is not cruel. It is the surgery of mercy. God does not cause suffering, but He uses it, not to test our endurance, but to deepen our capacity for compassion, to widen the channel through which His love flows into this world. I began to see my wound as holy ground, a place where the ordinary rules of existence had been suspended so that something extraordinary could enter. The absence of shams became a presence of its own, a constant reminder to seek the essence behind all forms, to love not just the reflection, but the light that creates all reflections. My poetry changed. It no longer came from the place of romantic longing for a single beloved friend, but from a vast ocean of longing for the source itself. Here is a practice for the days when your wounds speak loudest. Take a small notebook and write a letter addressed to your pain, not to the person or circumstance that caused it, but to the pain itself. Begin with, "You have been with me for so long," and continue without judgment, without trying to solve or dismiss anything. Write until your hand is tired, then close the notebook and place your palm upon it. Say aloud or in your heart, "I honor what you have come to teach me. I am listening now." Do this for 7 days, writing a little each day. On the 7th day, read all that you have written and add one final line. "Thank you for preparing me for a love I could not have contained before." Your wounds are not evidence of God's rejection. They are the places where divine love is actively at work, expanding your capacity to receive and to give. The voids left by loss become spaces where new life can root itself. This is the alchemy of grief, not its elimination, but its slow transformation into wisdom. As the Persian saying goes, the garden of life grows well only when watered by tears. Remember this truth that took me years to comprehend. The heart that has been broken open can never be closed again in the same way. And this is its glory. The cracks remain as testaments not to our damage, but to our expansion. They allow more light in, more love through. "Where the wound is, that is where the light enters," I once wrote. But now I would add, and once it has entered, it quietly rearranges everything it touches, until one day you realize the wound itself has become a window through which you see the world differently, with more tenderness, more understanding of its fragile, temporary beauty. God's mercy flows most visibly through our imperfections, not our strengths. This is what makes the broken heart such sacred territory. It has surrendered its illusion of self-sufficiency. It has become humble enough to receive. Your wounds have prepared a place within you where genuine healing, not the false healing of forgetting or numbing, but the true healing of integration, can finally begin. There comes a time in every spiritual journey when what you thought you knew crumbles beneath your feet. The prayers that once flowed easily from your lips turn to dust. The practices that once brought comfort become empty motions. The God you thought you understood becomes a stranger. I call this the inner fall, the collapse of the scaffolding of belief that once held your spiritual life together. It feels like failure. It feels like abandonment. It feels like the end. But I've walked through this desert, and I can tell you with the certainty born of experience, this fall is not the end of your journey. It is the true beginning. I remember the night my own spiritual identity shattered. It was several years after Shams had gone. I'd established myself again as a teacher. Students came from distant lands to hear my discourses. I led prayers. I composed poetry. I fulfilled all the external requirements of a man of faith. But inside, a terrible emptiness had been growing. My words about God felt hollow, borrowed from books rather than birthed from experience. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I walked alone to the small mosque where I usually prayed. I knelt on the prayer rug, pressed my forehead to the ground, as I had done thousands of times before, and suddenly, nothing. No words would come, no feeling of connection arose, just a vast, echoing absence where God had once seemed to be. I stayed there, frozen between prostration and despair, unable to rise, unable to pray. Hours passed. The night grew cold around me, and in that terrible silence, a question formed itself. What if everything I have been teaching is merely words? What if my piety has been nothing but a performance? What if God is not what I have claimed him to be? These questions were not intellectual doubts to be debated and resolved. They were earthquakes shaking the very foundation of my being. I had built my life, my identity, my purpose around being a man who knew God, who spoke for God, who led others to God. Now that certainty was gone, and in its place was a void I could neither cross nor fill. Dawn found me still on the prayer rug, but something had changed. I had stopped struggling against the void. I had stopped trying to reproduce the feelings and certainties of the past. I had surrendered to the fall itself, and in that surrender, I discovered that I was still held, still loved, still connected to something beyond my understanding. Not the God I'd been describing in my sermons, that God had indeed died during the night, but something deeper, vaster, more intimate than all my previous theologies had allowed for. The fall had not separated me from God, it had cleared away the images and concepts of God that had come between us. This is the third paradox I offer you. What appears as spiritual failure is often spiritual initiation. What feels like the death of faith can be the birth of a more authentic relationship with the divine. The collapse of your certainties is not punishment, it is invitation. God is removing the barriers you have placed between yourself and direct experience of the sacred. Your concepts of spirituality must die so that genuine spirituality may live in you. Many who follow a spiritual path reach this precipice and then turn back in fear. They redouble their efforts at traditional practice, they memorize more scriptures, they perform more rituals, hoping to regain the certainty and comfort they once knew. But I urge you, do not turn back. Step into the fall. Allow yourself to descend through all the layers of knowing into the cloud of unknowing. This is where the most profound transformation occurs. If these words are touching something deep in you, if you feel this conversation is for your soul, subscribe to this channel. Here, I share teachings for those seeking truth, transformation, and the awakening of the heart. Activate the bell so my words continue reaching you. After that night in the mosque, my teaching changed. I no longer spoke with the authority of one who had mastered spiritual knowledge. I spoke from the vulnerability of one who had been mastered by it. I no longer offered answers, but rather invited others into the questions that had broken me open. And strangely, more people came. They recognized in my words the authentic voice of experience, not the hollow echo of doctrine. They sensed that I had been where they secretly feared to go, and had returned with news of what waits on the other side of spiritual crisis. What waits there is not certainty, but mystery. Not answers, but deepening questions. Not an image of God, but the imageless reality that no concept can contain. You emerge from the inner fall with fewer beliefs, but more faith. Fewer words, but more wisdom. This is the maturation of the spiritual life. From the God you want to the God who is. From the comfort of religious identity to the naked truth of being. When you find yourself in this place of falling, when prayers feel empty, when God seems absent, when doubt clouds everything you once held clear, remember that you are not alone. Every mystic, every genuine spiritual teacher has passed through this dark night. It is the universal initiation into a more authentic relationship with the divine. The caterpillar must dissolve before the butterfly can emerge. So too must your constructed spiritual identity dissolve before your authentic connection with God can manifest. Here's a simple practice for times of spiritual darkness. Each morning, sit in silence for 5 minutes and say only this: I do not know what you are, but I open myself to what you would show me today. Then go about your day with attention, noticing what arises without forcing it into familiar patterns of meaning. At night, before sleep, sit again in silence and ask, what did you show me today that I almost missed? This practice honors both the mystery of God and your own honest not knowing. It creates space for a new kind of relationship to grow, one based not on what you think about God, but on how you experience the sacred directly. The inner fall teaches us that God is not an object of knowledge, but the very subject who knows through us. Not a being to be grasped, but the very ground of being itself. This understanding cannot be taught, it must be lived. It comes not from accumulating more information, but from letting go of the barriers to direct experience. As I wrote after my night in the mosque, do not seek water, seek thirst, and water will find you. Remember this, your doubts do not displease God. Your questions do not diminish faith, but deepen it. Your willingness to fall, to not know, to surrender the comfortable illusions you have lived by, this is the most profound act of trust possible. It says, I value truth more than comfort. I value authentic relationship with you more than the security of my religious ideas about you. This is the faith that endures when beliefs falter. This is the love that remains when certainties depart. The inner fall is not the end of your spiritual journey. It is the doorway through which you pass from a religion about God to direct relationship with the divine. Everything before was preparation. Everything after will be revelation. Trust the fall. Trust the darkness. Trust the unknowing. This is how caterpillars become butterflies. This is how humans awaken to their divine nature. This is how love matures from concept to lived reality. After the darkness of spiritual night, after the collapse of certainties, after the humbling descent into unknowing comes the quiet dawn of a new way of being. I speak now of the discipline of the heart, not as harsh training or rigid observance, but as the gentle, persistent cultivation of inner order that allows divine love to flow more freely through your life. Many imagine that spiritual freedom means the absence of structure, that to be guided by God is to abandon all personal effort. This is the misconception of beginners. I have walked both paths, the path of chaotic emotion and the path of loving discipline, and I tell you with the authority of experience, it is in the cultivation of daily faithfulness that the soul finds its true liberation. When Shams first entered my life, he shattered all my orderly theological frameworks. The whirlwind of that meeting swept away my careful structures of thought and practice. For a time, I lived in that beautiful chaos, that ecstatic disruption of everything familiar. It was necessary. It broke open calcified patterns and allowed fresh life to enter. But had I remained there, in that state of perpetual disruption, perpetual ecstasy, perpetual breaking, I would have become like a garden where the soil is constantly turned, where no seed has time to root, where no fruit ever ripens. After Shams departed, after I had fallen through grief into a deeper understanding, I discovered the necessity of creating a vessel strong enough to contain the wine of divine love. That vessel is what I call the discipline of the heart. Each morning in Kanya, as the first light touched the minarets, I would rise and follow a simple pattern of devotion. First, silence, not filled with requests or even praise, but simple presence with the presence. Then, the cleansing of body and space, the washing of hands, face, and feet, the sweeping of my small room, the ordering of books and papers. Next, the reading of just a few lines of sacred text, not to accumulate knowledge, but to allow a single truth to penetrate deeply. Finally, the setting of one clear intention for the day, not a list of tasks, but a quality of being I wished to embody. These were not grand gestures. They required no special talent or understanding. They were available to anyone willing to show up day after day with sincerity and attention. What I discovered through this daily practice was that God is most powerfully present, not in the dramatic ruptures of routine, but in the faithful tending of ordinary moments. This is the fourth paradox I offer you. Discipline is not the enemy of spiritual freedom, but its necessary container. The heart that practices devotion daily becomes not rigid, but more supple, more responsive to divine guidance, more available to love's spontaneous movements. Structure, when entered with love rather than fear, does not confine the spirit, but creates the conditions in which spirit can safely expand. I recall a period of great dryness in my own practice when all joy had gone out of my devotions, and I continued only from habit and commitment. Each morning I would unroll my prayer mat, feeling nothing but weariness. Each evening I would sit in meditation, feeling nothing but restlessness. For weeks this continued, and I began to wonder if I was merely going through empty motions, if the fire that once animated my spiritual life had gone out completely. Then, one ordinary evening, as I sat in my customary place, watching the lamp's small flame and feeling the familiar absence of feeling, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with visions or ecstasy. Simply, quietly, I became aware that I had been sitting all along in a great presence that required nothing from me, not emotion, not understanding, not special experiences. Just this, showing up again and again with whatever I had or did not have to offer. That night I wrote these words: "The faithful heart does not seek God. It simply creates the conditions in which God can be recognized. This is the secret that many spiritual seekers miss in their search for dramatic experiences. God is already fully present. Our task is not to reach some distant divine realm, but to cultivate the awareness that can perceive what is already here, already given, already complete. And this cultivation happens not through sporadic moments of intensity, but through patient, daily practice. Here is a simple discipline I encourage you to try. For 40 days, commit to waking 15 minutes earlier than usual. Use this time not for planning or worrying, but for sitting in silence with one hand on your heart. Breathe slowly and deeply. Feel the rhythm of your own life beneath your palm. Say nothing, ask nothing, simply be present to what is, the breath moving in and out, the heart beating steadily, the first light touching the world. After just a few moments of this practice, choose one small action that brings order to your external space. Make your bed with care, wash a dish with full attention, arrange objects on a table with intention. This linking of inner and outer order creates a harmony that invites divine presence to become more perceptible in your daily life. The discipline of the heart is not about achieving perfection. It is about creating a stable foundation from which authentic spiritual life can grow. Think of it as tending a garden. You cannot force flowers to bloom, but you can remove weeds, you can water faithfully, you can ensure that soil is nourishing. The blooming itself remains mysterious, a gift rather than an achievement. So too in spiritual practice. We do not create the divine presence through our efforts, but we can create conditions that allow us to perceive and respond to the presence that is always already here. There were days in my life when I failed in my own disciplines, when grief or distraction or simple human weakness kept me from the practices I had committed to. On those days, I learned perhaps the most important aspect of spiritual discipline: gentleness with oneself. The heart that cannot forgive its own failings cannot truly open to divine forgiveness. The perfectionism that drives many spiritual seekers becomes itself the greatest barrier to genuine spiritual growth. So when you fail, and you will fail, return simply to the practice without self-condemnation. This too is discipline, the faithful returning, the humble beginning again, the persistent orientation toward what matters most. What I want you to understand, beloved friend, is that the structure of spiritual practice exists not to earn God's favor, but to deepen your capacity to receive what is already freely given. Order in the outer life creates space for the inner life to flourish. Consistency in small things builds trustworthiness in larger things. The heart that keeps its daily appointments with the divine develops a sensitivity to guidance that cannot be gained through sporadic moments of inspiration. As water, falling drop by drop, eventually wears a channel through stone, so does faithful practice eventually create a pathway through which divine love can flow unobstructed into every aspect of your life. The faithful heart that maintains its daily appointment with God begins to notice subtle transformations. I speak now of the signs that appear, not as dramatic miracles that overwhelm the senses, but as quiet confirmations that whisper rather than shout. Many seek spectacular evidence of divine favor, sudden wealth, instantaneous healing, supernatural interventions that cannot be explained. And in this seeking of the spectacular, they miss the miracle that is already unfolding within and around them. I know this blindness well, for I too once demanded that God prove himself according to my expectations. It was only when I surrendered these demands that I began to see how persistently, how tenderly, how ingeniously the Beloved leaves traces of his presence in the ordinary fabric of our days. It was in the second year after my great awakening in the mosque that I began to notice the changes. They came so gradually that at first I did not recognize them as the divine response to my prayers. I simply knew that I was sleeping more peacefully, that the constant internal chatter had quieted, that my interactions with others had acquired a gentleness I had not consciously cultivated. One morning, as I walked through the marketplace in Konya, a merchant called me over to his stall. He was an older man with whom I had often haggled rather tensely in the past. "Something has changed in you," he said, studying my face with curiosity. "Your eyes are different." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, unable to articulate it precisely. "You used to look at things as if you were always calculating their worth," he finally said. "Now you look at things as if you are grateful they exist at all." I walked away from that encounter deeply moved, for the merchant had perceived what I myself had not yet fully recognized, the gradual transformation of my perception. I had been practicing presence, gratitude, and attentiveness, not to change how I saw the world, but simply out of faithfulness to the practices themselves. Yet, without my noticing, these disciplines had indeed changed not just my mood or my thoughts, but my very way of seeing. This is the fifth paradox I offer you. Transformation occurs not when we focus on transformation itself, but when we focus on faithfulness. The divine alchemy works best when we are not constantly checking the crucible to see if the lead has turned to gold. That evening, I sat in my garden as the last light faded from the sky and reflected on the merchant's words. How had this change occurred without my awareness? I'd been looking for God's response to my prayers in dramatic events, in obvious interventions, but the response had come in this subtle shifting of perception, this quiet liberation from the calculating mind, this effortless gratitude that now arose where criticism once dominated. The prayer had been answered not by changing my circumstances, but by changing the eyes through which I viewed all circumstances. And this, I realized, is the nature of true spiritual transformation, not an escape from the conditions of human life, but a profound alteration in how we experience those conditions. As my awareness of these subtle changes grew, I began to notice other signs that had been present all along, but that my preoccupation with dramatic divine intervention had caused me to overlook. There was the way certain passages from sacred texts would arise in my mind precisely when their wisdom was needed. There was the inexplicable sense of being guided to turn left rather than right while walking, only to encounter someone who needed exactly the word of comfort I could offer. There was the quiet certainty that arose within when facing decisions, a clarity that came not from weighing pros and cons, but from a deeper listening. These were not the burning bushes or parting seas of ancient scripture. They were whispers rather than shouts, hints rather than declarations. Yet their cumulative effect was a profound confirmation that I was not walking this path alone, that divine intelligence was intimately involved in the details of my life. This recognition brought me to tears one night as I sat beneath the stars. I'd been asking for signs, demanding proof, seeking confirmation, when all along the signs had been as numerous as these stars. Quiet, constant, faithful lights that become visible only when we cease our restless movement and allow our eyes to adjust to a different kind of seeing. The universe had not been withholding evidence of divine presence. I had been moving too quickly, looking in the wrong direction, demanding that God communicate in ways that satisfied my ego rather than opening myself to how God actually speaks. Here is a practice to help you recognize the subtle signs of transformation in your own life. At the end of each day, take a few moments to write down 3 small changes or patterns you have noticed. Not dramatic events or achievements, but subtle shifts, perhaps in how you respond to frustration, or in your capacity to remain present during a difficult conversation, or in the spontaneous gratitude that arises for something you previously took for granted. Over time, these notes become a record of the divine handiwork in your life, a testament to the quiet miracle of transformation that is always underway beneath the surface of your awareness. As you practice this attentiveness to subtle signs, you will begin to notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that defy rational explanation. The very question that has been occupying your mind, suddenly addressed in a conversation you overhear between strangers. The book that falls open to precisely the passage you need to read. The unexpected encounter that provides exactly the connection you have been seeking. These are not random events, but threads in the intricate tapestry of divine communication. They do not violate natural law. They reveal a deeper order within which natural law operates, an order that responds to the sincere heart's deepest questions and needs. I remember sitting with a group of disciples one evening when the conversation turned to the question of how we can know if God hears our prayers. Many offered theological explanations, quoting scriptures and authorities. I listened silently until all had spoken, then told them this story. A poor woman in our city had been praying for help to feed her children. That morning, as she walked to the well, deeply worried, she found a small coin in the dust. Not enough to buy what was needed, but enough to buy a candle. Rather than curse the insufficiency of the gift, she used the coin to buy the candle and placed it in her window as an act of gratitude. A wealthy merchant passing by noticed the candle burning in the window of such a humble home and was moved by curiosity to knock on the door. Learning of the woman's situation, he provided food not just for that day but for many days to come. Then I asked my disciples, did God answer her prayer? Some said yes through the coin and the merchant. Others argued no, that it was mere coincidence. I suggested a different perspective. God's answer began the moment she chose gratitude over resentment, the moment she lit the candle instead of cursing the darkness. That choice itself was the beginning of abundance. This is what I wish you to understand about transformation and its signs. The evidence of divine response to your deepest needs rarely comes in the form you expect or demand. It comes in the altered perception that allows you to see abundance where you once saw only lack. It comes in the quiet strength to face what you once avoided. It comes in the capacity to remain open-hearted where you once closed in self-protection. It comes in the spontaneous gratitude that replaces constant craving. The silence that once felt like abandonment now feels like presence. The solitude that once felt like punishment now feels like gift. These are the true miracles, not violations of natural law, but the revelation of a deeper order that was always present beneath the surface of things. The most reliable sign of spiritual transformation is this. What you once pursued with anxious effort now arises spontaneously from your being. Love flows without agenda. Generosity gives without calculation. Peace persists even in difficulty. This is not achievement, but revelation, the uncovering of your true nature, which was always whole, always connected to the divine, always capable of embodying love's highest expression in the world. As I wrote after recognizing these subtle transformations in my own life, what you seek is seeking you, and has been all along. I've walked with you now through the silence of pain, through the healing of wounds, through the inner fall that shatters false certainties, through the discipline that creates a vessel for divine love, and through the subtle transformations that confirm your journey. I come now to the final lesson, the one that gathers all others into a single truth. Peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of love in the midst of all conditions. Many imagine that spiritual maturity means reaching a state where challenges no longer arise, where emotions no longer disturb, where life flows always in accordance with our wishes. This is not what I found at the end of my own long journey. What I discovered instead was far more valuable, the capacity to remain open-hearted and present, regardless of external or internal conditions. This is the peace that passes understanding, not because it is complicated, but because it cannot be reached through thinking alone. In the final years of my life in Kenya, after all the drama of loss and awakening had quieted, after the poems had poured forth and found their audiences, after the whirling dances had revealed their secrets, I entered a period of what I can only call ordinary grace. The spectacular spiritual experiences that had once seemed so important became less frequent and less necessary. In their place arose a quiet constancy, a gentle persistence of divine companionship through all the mundane activities of daily life. I still experienced grief, frustration, confusion, and doubt. These did not vanish, but they no longer defined my reality or determined my choices. They moved through me like weather through the sky, while something deeper remained unchanged, unthreatened, perpetually at rest in its own nature. One afternoon, I sat with a young disciple who had come to me in great distress. He had been practicing spiritual disciplines with intensity for several years and had experienced moments of great illumination. But lately, he confessed, everything had become ordinary again. Prayer felt routine. Meditation revealed no new insights. Scripture offered no fresh revelations. He feared he had somehow fallen from grace, that God had withdrawn the special favor once shown to him. I listened to his concerns with compassion, recognizing in them my own former preoccupation with spiritual experiences. When he finished speaking, I picked up an empty cup that sat between us. "What is the purpose of this cup?" I asked him. Puzzled, he replied that it was for drinking water. "And if I filled it with the purest water from the deepest well, would that change its purpose?" "No," he said, "it would fulfill its purpose." "So too with your life," I told him. "Its purpose is not to be filled with extraordinary experiences, but to hold and express the ordinary love that is our true nature. The moments of illumination are like fresh water poured into the cup. They refresh and inspire, but they do not change the cup's essential purpose." The young man looked disappointed, so I continued. "Let me tell you a secret that took me decades to learn. The extraordinary experiences you seek are merely signposts pointing toward what is always available. The simple, profound miracle of being fully present to this moment with this breath in this body, with whatever joy or sorrow it contains. God is not more present in ecstasy than in ordinary awareness. The divine does not come and go. Only our recognition comes and goes. The final peace is not in having extraordinary experiences, but in discovering the extraordinary that waits within the ordinary, when it is met with complete attention and open-hearted presence. This is the sixth paradox I offer you. True spiritual maturity is not marked by increased specialness, but by increased ordinariness. Not by more dramatic experiences of the divine, but by the growing capacity to recognize and honor the divine in the most mundane aspects of human existence. The washing of dishes, the preparing of food, the listening to a friend, the tying of a shoelace. When these are done with complete presence, with undivided attention, with the full engagement of heart and mind, they become not barriers to spiritual life, but its very substance. This is what Jesus meant by praying without ceasing, what Buddha pointed to with mindfulness, what all the great traditions indicate through their spiritual practices, the gradual awakening to what is always already here, the love that holds and interpenetrates all things. If this message resonated in your soul, subscribe and be part of this awakening journey. Each week I bring wisdom for those who chose the path of true transformation and leave in the comments, "I am ready to find peace in the ordinary." This simple declaration marks the beginning of your journey back home, back to yourself. The great lesson that came to me near the end of my life was this: we do not need to make ourselves extraordinary. We need only to recognize the extraordinary that we already are, beneath all the layers of forgetting, beneath all the distractions of ego, beneath all the wounds and defenses that seem to separate us from our essential nature. This recognition does not come through striving, but through a profound relaxation into what is already true. It comes not by adding something to yourself, but by removing the obstacles to what has been present all along. I remember an evening when I sat in my garden as the call to prayer sounded from the nearby mosque. I had heard this call thousands of times before, had responded to it with the prescribed movements of devotion. But on this particular evening, something shifted. I did not move to perform the ritual prayer. Instead, I simply sat, listening to the call itself, the human voice rising and falling, carrying ancient words into the twilight air. And in that listening, with nothing added, nothing sought, nothing needed, I experienced a completion so perfect, it brought tears to my eyes. There was nothing missing from that moment. No spiritual achievement would have improved it. No divine revelation would have made it more sacred than it already was. This, I realized, is the peace we are all seeking, not a special state to be attained, but the recognition of the completeness that is our birthright, available whenever we stop seeking and simply allow ourselves to be fully present to what is. Here is the final practice I offer you, one that I return to again and again in my later years. Intentional ordinariness. Choose one routine activity that you normally rush through or perform while thinking of other things, perhaps drinking a glass of water, or walking from one room to another, or washing your hands. For 1 week, commit to performing this action with complete presence. Feel the sensations in your body. Notice the thoughts that arise and gently let them pass without following them. Experience the activity as if you were doing it for the first time, with curiosity and openness rather than habitual inattention. You will discover that there is no such thing as an ordinary moment when it is met with extraordinary presence. This practice may seem too simple to be transformative. That is precisely its power. We have been conditioned to believe that spiritual growth requires complex techniques, esoteric knowledge, dramatic experiences. But the most profound transformation comes through the simplest means, the return of attention to what is directly experienced in this moment. As one of my later poems says, "The treasure you seek abroad waits at home, buried in the center of your own garden." The peace I speak of is not an achievement but a recognition. It does not depend on solving all problems or removing all pain from your life. It comes from the growing capacity to hold all experiences, pleasant and unpleasant, within a larger awareness that is itself unchanged by what moves through it. Like the sky that remains vast and open, regardless of whether it holds sunshine or storms, this awareness, your true nature, remains whole and undamaged regardless of the thoughts, emotions, and sensations that pass through it. To recognize this unchanging awareness in the midst of changing experience is to find the peace that nothing can disturb. In my final days, as the body weakened and prepared for its return to dust, I found myself filled with an unexpected gratitude for all of it, the pain as well as the pleasure, the confusion as well as the clarity, the losses as well as the gains. All of it had served its purpose in revealing what cannot be lost, what cannot be damaged, what cannot die. This discovery waits for each of us, not in some distant future or exalted state, but here and now in the midst of our ordinary human lives. The divine is not elsewhere. Heaven is not later. As I wrote in what would become one of my most quoted poems, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." Remember this, beloved friend. God has never been absent. You have never been alone. The love you seek has been present from the beginning, waiting only for your recognition. The journey home is not a journey through space or time, but a journey of remembrance. You are already what you seek to become. You already contain what you hope to find. As you let go of the search for something more or better or different than this moment, this breath, this ordinary miracle of being, you will discover the extraordinary truth that has been waiting patiently for your return. You are loved, you are held, you are home.